There's a guy at your gym. You've seen him. He's in his late 30s, he's fit, he laughs easily, he's got plans on the weekend that don't involve explaining himself to anyone. Someone asks him when he's going to settle down and he doesn't flinch, doesn't get defensive, doesn't launch into an apology for his choices. He just smiles and says, "I'm good." And somehow that answer lands with more quiet confidence than most people carry in their entire personality. That guy isn't broken. He isn't waiting. He isn't afraid of commitment. He made a decision, a real, examined, deliberate decision, and the psychology behind that decision is far more sophisticated than most people ever give it credit for. At Psyche Shift, we cover the kind of behavioral science that challenges what you thought you already knew. And this topic is exactly that kind of territory. Because once you look at the actual research on men who consciously choose single life, you stop seeing a deficit and start seeing a very specific kind of psychological architecture. One that most people never build, not because they can't, but because nobody told them it was worth building. Here are 10 facts that explain what's actually going on inside that architecture. Fact 1. They stopped inheriting other people's blueprints. Most men grow up with a life plan they never actually drafted. Graduate, find someone, commit, build a household. The plan gets handed to them so early and reinforced so often that by the time they're adults, following it doesn't feel like a choice. It just feels like gravity. Men who consciously stay single have done something that sounds simple but is actually rare. They stepped back far enough to ask whether the blueprint was ever theirs to begin with. Psychologist Dan McAdams spent decades studying what he called personal narrative identity, the story you tell yourself about who you are and where your life is going. His research showed that people who actively author their own story, rather than defaulting to an inherited one, report significantly higher life satisfaction over time, not because their story is more dramatic or more successful, but because it's theirs. Now consider what it takes to consciously step off the default path. You have to tolerate the confusion of not knowing what your alternative looks like. You have to withstand the discomfort of other people's concern and confusion. You have to build your framework from scratch rather than inheriting someone else's floor plan. The men who do that and come out the other side aren't running from connection. They're running towards something most people never get, a life they can actually recognize as their own. Pull back and ask yourself this. When was the last time you made a major life decision because you actually wanted that outcome, not because the timeline said it was due? That question alone can shift something fundamental in how you move forward. Fact 2. They're nervous. For men who are single unwillingly, there's real data to back that assumption up. But flip the variable. Look specifically at men who report choosing and genuinely wanting this lifestyle. And the picture reverses in a way researchers didn't fully anticipate. Studies tracking long-term cortisol patterns, which is your body's primary marker for chronic stress, found that voluntarily single individuals with high life satisfaction scores showed lower sustained stress indicators than men in high conflict or low compatibility relationships. The key phrase there is voluntary and satisfied. That combination produces a nervous system that isn't quietly fighting itself every day. Now here's what most people overlook entirely. Chronic relationship tension, the kind that builds when two people are mismatched in values, needs, or communication styles, doesn't always feel like a crisis. It often just hums in the background. Low-grade friction that you stop noticing because it becomes your normal. A man whose daily environment is aligned with what he actually values doesn't have that background noise. His baseline is genuinely calmer, not because he's numb or emotionally closed off, but because there's no internal conflict between who he is and how he's living. Alignment is a health variable. Most people don't frame it that way, but the physiology makes the case pretty clearly. Worth sitting with. Where in your life right now is there a gap between what you actually want and how you're actually living? That gap has a biological cost, and most people are paying it without realizing it. Fact 3. They've built something called autonomous mastery. Nathan spent most of his 20s in a series of relationships where he was constantly, quietly adjusting himself. Not because anyone was forcing him to, but because relationships require negotiation, and over time, negotiation became compression. He stopped pursuing the woodworking projects he genuinely loved. He stopped taking the long solo road trips that helped him think. He stopped finishing things. When he finally made peace with being single and stopped treating it as a temporary condition to outgrow, something shifted. He started completing things again. A home renovation, a side business, 3 courses he'd started and abandoned. He described it as finally getting his own signal back. This tracks directly with what psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan established through decades of research in self-determination theory. Autonomy, the experience of your choices genuinely driving your actions, isn't just a preference, it's a fundamental psychological need. When it's consistently overridden, motivation deteriorates. When it's consistently honoured, motivation compounds. Men who stay single by choice tend to develop what you might call a clean execution loop. They set a goal because they want it, pursue it on their own terms, and receive the full psychological reward of completing it without division. That reward loop builds on itself, and over time, it creates a level of self-efficacy, genuine confidence in your own ability to produce outcomes, that changes how a man carries himself. Here's what's worth trying. Take the last 3 goals you've set and trace where they actually came from. Were they genuinely yours? Or were they shaped by someone else's expectations, wearing the costume of your own ambition? The answer tells you more about your current psychology than almost anything else. Fact 4. Their friendships are structured differently, and that matters more than people realize. The assumption is that single men must be lonelier, less connected, missing the depth that comes with a long-term partner. And for some men, that assumption holds. But for men who are single by choice and socially intentional, their friendship landscape tends to be broader, more varied, and psychologically more resilient than that of many of their partnered counterparts. Here's the dynamic nobody talks about at dinner parties. When your romantic partner becomes your primary emotional outlet, your closest confidant, your social default, and your support system all at once, you've collapsed an entire network into a single relationship. That feels intimate, but it's also fragile. One crack in that relationship and a man's entire social and emotional structure can destabilize simultaneously. Intentionally, single men, almost by necessity, distribute their relational investment. They build what sociologists studying network theory call diversified social capital. Different people meeting different needs across a wider web. Robin Dunbar's research on social bonding from Oxford found that men who maintain varied, layered social connections demonstrate stronger psychological resilience and, perhaps surprisingly, slower cognitive decline as they age. The man who has a long-standing friendship group, a mentor, a few people he trains with, and a handful of people who genuinely challenge his thinking, his psychological support structure is load-bearing in every direction. Something practical to try. Draw a rough map of your current social world. If your single closest relationship disappeared tomorrow, what percentage of your support structure would go with it? That number is your social vulnerability score, and it's worth bringing down regardless of your relationship status. Fact 5. They've built an interior life. Most people never develop. There's a specific kind of discomfort that most people will do almost anything to avoid. It's not pain exactly. It's the silence you encounter when there's no distraction left and you're alone with yourself. Most people fill that silence immediately, with a screen, with noise, with movement, with another person. Because in that silence, they actually meet themselves. And for a lot of people, that meeting reveals things they haven't dealt with. Men who choose single life and thrive in it have, through practice, through necessity or both, developed what psychologist Esther Buchholz described as the capacity for aloneness. This is genuinely distinct from loneliness. Loneliness is involuntary disconnection. The capacity for aloneness is the ability to be present with yourself, sustain your own sense of meaning, and feel whole without external input filling every gap. And here's the piece that changes the conversation completely. That capacity isn't only valuable for living single, it's the psychological foundation for choosing a partner from a position of genuine wholeness rather than emotional dependency. Men who cannot be alone tend to enter relationships to escape their own interior, which is a different transaction entirely than choosing to share your life with someone. The men who thrive while single have typically built an interior rich enough that they're not running from it. They're not closed off to connection. They've simply stopped needing someone else to make being themselves feel bearable. Something to actually do this week. Spend 30 minutes completely alone with no input. No music, no podcast, no scrolling. Notice what surfaces. Whatever you find yourself most wanting to avoid in that silence, that's usually exactly what's been quietly running in the background of your decisions. Fact 6. Their financial behavior reflects a different kind of clarity. This one is less about earning and more about the psychology underneath the spending. Research on financial decision-making shows that voluntarily single men, when they're intentional about their choices, often build financial stability at a different rate. Not necessarily because they have more income, but because of what behavioral economists call goal clarity concentration, when every financial decision is yours alone to make. Without negotiation or compromise, you can align your spending tightly with what you actually value. Ryan, a mid-30s logistics coordinator, spent his single years paying off his vehicle, building a cushion that let him weather a job change without panic, and investing in a professional certification that changed his career trajectory entirely. He wasn't earning significantly more than his married friends. He was simply allocating with complete precision toward goals that were entirely his own. But here's the nuance that actually matters. The research also shows that men who struggle financially while single tend to spend reactively, buying comfort items or experiences to fill emotional gaps rather than build towards something. The difference between a man building wealth while single and a man treading water financially isn't the relationship status, it's the emotional clarity underneath the spending habits. A question worth being honest about. Pull up the last 60 days of purchases, sort them mentally into two piles: decisions made from genuine intention versus decisions made to fill something. Which pile is heavier? That ratio tells you more about your financial trajectory than your income ever will. Fact 7. They've done the emotional work. Without a witness, culture has a quiet assumption built into it that men develop emotionally through relationships. And for many men, that's genuinely true. The friction, the mirroring, the challenge of navigating someone else's emotional world, all of that can accelerate growth in real ways. But there's another path. Harder in some ways, quieter in others. And men who take it often develop an emotional architecture that's genuinely different in quality. When you're single for an extended period and you're not numbing yourself with distractions, you have to learn to regulate your own emotional states without external assistance. Your partner isn't there to tell you when you're being reactive. Nobody's soothing you after a rough day. You have to build that capacity internally, learning to recognize your own dysregulation, name it accurately, and move through it without an audience. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett's research on what she calls emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish your emotional states with precision, shows that people who develop this skill make better decisions under pressure, recover more quickly from setbacks, and demonstrate measurably better physical health over time. A man who has processed loss, confusion, failure, and satisfaction largely on his own, without outsourcing the processing to someone else's presence, has an emotional foundation that's genuinely load-bearing. He's not guarded, he's built. Try this specifically. Start naming your emotional states with more precision than stressed or fine. What flavor of frustration is it actually? What specific kind of satisfaction? That granularity practice alone builds the internal regulation that most adults have never been taught to develop. Fact 8. They stopped treating their real life as a waiting room. Once you recognize this pattern, you see it everywhere. A large number of men are running a quiet background program that says, "My actual life starts when the right circumstances arrive, when I meet someone, when I get the right job, when the timing is better. Until then, everything is preliminary, a rehearsal for the real performance." The psychological cost of that orientation is invisible but enormous. You're treating your actual present, every morning you wake up, every choice you make today, as less real, less important, less worth investing in than some future version that hasn't arrived yet. Men who choose single life and genuinely thrive in it have usually found a way to dismantle that waiting pattern. They've accepted, sometimes after real struggle, that right now is the main event, not a draft, not a prologue, the actual thing. Viktor Frankl, whose work on meaning-making came from circumstances far heavier than relationship choices, argued that meaning isn't discovered passively. It's constructed through deliberate engagement with the life you actually have. Men who are flourishing while single have usually started that construction. They've committed to work that genuinely matters to them, to communities they're building, to skills they're developing, not because someone's watching, but because the alternative is a life spent in permanent anticipation. A genuinely useful reframe. Is there anything you've been quietly waiting on permission for? Something you'd pursue if you had a partner to validate the choice? Start that thing alone. The person who decides to begin anyway, without waiting on external confirmation, is the version of yourself worth building a life around. Fact 9. They know what they actually value, not what they were told to value when you hold an unconventional. Life choice across years, society will pressure test it constantly. Family gatherings, cultural defaults, well-meaning people who frame your singleness as a problem to be solved. It's a steady current pushing against your position, and staying upright in that current without becoming bitter, rigid or defensive requires something specific. You have to actually know what you value and why. You can't coast through that kind of sustained social pressure. Coasting means eventually drifting back toward the default. Holding ground requires you to have done real thinking. This is why research by social psychologist Bella DePaulo, who has spent decades specifically studying single identity and what she calls singleism in culture, consistently finds that satisfied single individuals demonstrate higher self-concept clarity than many of their partnered counterparts. They know who they are, not perfectly, not without doubt, but deliberately. Consider the difference between someone who learns their values through external contrast, through other people's reactions, through conflict, through seeing what they can't live with, and someone who learns their values through extended self-examination. Both routes can produce self-knowledge, but the second route tends to produce a quieter, more stable version of it, the kind you can feel in how a person occupies a room. For your own reflection, write down 5 values you'd claim as genuinely non-negotiable. Then audit the last 6 months of actual decisions against that list. The gap between what you claim to value and how you've actually behaved. That gap is where the real work lives. Fact 10. They've written their own definition of a good life. Everything in this video has been circling this final point, and here's where it lands. The deepest psychological fact about men who choose single life and report genuine happiness isn't about what they've avoided, it's about what they've built. Specifically, they've done the uncomfortable, often long, frequently unglamorous work of defining what a good life actually looks like for them, on their own terms, not borrowed from a template. Consider someone like Adrian, 43 years old, works in healthcare administration, earns a moderate income, spends his Friday evenings cooking meals he genuinely enjoys making, mentors 2 younger men from his neighbourhood on weekends, has 4 friendships deep enough to be honest in, and is in the middle of learning a second language purely because it interests him. He doesn't talk about his life as a consolation prize. He talks about it as something he built specifically for himself. Is he missing things? Of course. every life is missing something. But here's the research finding that reframes the entire conversation. Positive psychologist Sonia Lyubomirsky's work on sustainable happiness found that roughly 40% of your long-term well-being is determined not by your circumstances but by your intentional activity. The things you deliberately choose to do and the meaning you actively construct from your experience. 40% that isn't about what happened to you. 40% that belongs entirely to how you engage. The men who thrive while single have applied that 40% with focus and precision. They've invested specifically in the experiences, relationships, contributions, and growth that actually move the needle for them, not for public validation, not to satisfy someone else's timeline, for their own carefully considered, genuinely examined sense of what a full life looks like. That is, at its core, a form of psychological courage, the kind that most people, whether partnered or single, never quite gather enough of. The point of all 10 of these facts taken together isn't that staying single is superior. The psychology doesn't say that, and neither do I. What the research actually points to is something more useful and more portable than a relationship: status ranking. Conscious choice, self-knowledge, and intentional living are the variables that actually predict human satisfaction. Not a specific arrangement, not a particular milestone. The men in these facts aren't thriving because they're single. They're thriving because they decided, really decided, to stop being passengers in their own story. And that decision, it belongs to everyone.